Hi, my name is Glenn Kenny. I write about films for RogerEbert.com and the New York Times. They wanted me to talk about ecological disaster end-of-the-world movies. You can't talk about these movies without talking about end-of-the-world movies in general. I'm going to discuss it from my point of view, which is the point of view of an American born in the tail end of the 1950s who watched a lot of movies on television. There was the 1936 picture Things to Come, which was directed by William Cameron Menzies, from a story, treatment, and script by H.G. Wells. In Things to Come, the world ends and is revived more than once. It falls as a result of war.
There is war and rumor of war.
Then it falls as a result of disease. And then we go into a future where there's a large debate about how far progress should go and how far science could go. And that ends up being the main point of the movie, as relative to what was going on in 1936, the movie was notable for its design. William Cameron Menzies was a great production designer as well as a director, and the futuristic designs of this were in a sense an answer to what was done by Fritz Lang in Metropolis, which was a film that H.G. Wells himself dismissed as nonsensical. Another film that was a very important end-of-the-world movie was 1951's When Worlds Collide.
Forces of nature unleashed in all their terrifying force.
Now, that was not an ecological disaster movie in which humans are to blame for the end of the world, which is what we get in Waterworld. This was a film in which a rogue star was coming toward the Earth. It was going to throw the planet out of its orbit and create a condition under which human life would not be sustainable.
A distant star racing through space toward an inevitable collision with this planet.
So various scientific forces get together to build a giant rocket to take lottery winners to a new planet.
High on a mountaintop, an army of scientists work desperately to build this giant rocket, this modern Noah's Ark, to carry a few picked survivors of our doomed civilization to a new life on another world.
Where you really start getting the end of the world being our fault is in the 1950s, 1960s, because there was the anxiety over nuclear war, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the ending events of World War II ushered in what's called the atomic age.
Let us face, without panic, the reality of our times, the fact that atom bombs may someday be dropped on our cities.
And there were a number of films treating the atomic age as a potential disaster. Of course, there's On the Beach, the Stanley Kramer picture, a great social consciousness picture. Now, in movies where the world ends, the world doesn't really end, because most of the time people are still left on it. And the movies are about cataclysmic disasters that wipe out most of the population, but not all. Now, sometimes there are hundreds of thousands of survivors, and sometimes there's only a handful. A movie like Five, which is about 5 survivors of the end of the world trying to get along in a house. The World of Flesh and the Devil, which has a racial parable aspect to it, with 3 main characters trying to get along after the end of the world.
We have only one problem. There are 2 of us and 1 of her. What are we going to do about it?
Why don't you toss a coin?
World Without End, in which space travelers go through a time warp and come back to an Earth that's inhabited by mutants.
This was an awesome world, ravaged by atomic radiation, inhabited by mutated monsters.
Some of these are more fanciful than others. One film that was outstanding and striking is the 1961 British picture The Day the Earth Caught Fire, directed by Val Guest, in which atomic bomb testing creates meteorological phenomena that throws the Earth off its axis and creates a global warming situation of monumental proportions. To the extent that at the end of the movie, this black and white widescreen picture is tinted to get across the feeling of the intense heat. The solution that is eventually reached in this film is to detonate more bombs to throw the Earth back on its axis, and the movie has an indeterminate ending. You don't know whether or not it works. There are competing headlines for newspapers: World Saved or World Doomed. And of course, the movie ends before this is determined.
Share if you dare the unbearable suspense of men and women who have never in their lives faced greater peril.
There are a lot of ambiguous endings in films of this sort, and The Day the Earth Caught Fire is no exception. Up until a certain point, the treatments of the end of the world or the beginning of a new world were somewhat more fanciful, and this is exemplified in a film made a little before The Day the Earth Caught Fire, which is a adaptation of another H.G. Wells work, this one, The Time Machine, which was a George Pal film. George Pal made sci-fi fantasy movies with a comical, whimsical bent. And in this film, we have H.G. Wells himself, sort of, played by Rod Taylor, creating the titular time machine and going ahead to 1966. But in 1966, oh no, there's a nuclear explosion and the time machine is encased in rubble. So Rod Taylor's character, H.G. Wells, has to move so far ahead in time to a point where the rubble has eroded, and he ends up, by his calculation, in the year 800,002,701. And there he finds the bizarre society of the sybaritic Eloi and the parasitic Morlocks.
The Morlocks, fiendish creatures who live in a weird underground world.
The Eloi exemplified by the beautiful Yvette Mimieux.
Ah, the shape of things to come.
And this is a grim future for mankind, but as depicted in the movie, it's very colorful, very lively. It looks like an interesting environment. You don't really feel how awful it is because it's just so, there's something about the tone, the way it's shot and set up, that makes it look kind of neat. It's like a fantasy. You don't want to be in it, but it's still pretty fantastic.
How do you do? My name is Alfred Hitchcock, and I would like to tell you about my forthcoming lecture.
Alfred Hitchcock's 1963 The Birds, because of Hitchcock's reputation as a suspense genre filmmaker rather than a horror movie filmmaker, doesn't get talked about as much as I think it ought to be in this context, although of course the great Carlos Clarens did include it in his seminal book, his illustrated history of science fiction and horror films.
They're coming!
This is a movie in which nature rebels against man. There are intimations of the apocalypse throughout, and the movie ends on a note of ambiguity again. They get away from this particular group of birds, but who knows what it's going to be like where they're going. And the apocalyptic intimations of that film are made through dialogue, but also through Hitchcock's use of film language. There's the diner argument in which the ornithologist, played by Ethel Griffiths,
I do know. Ornithology happens to be my avocation.
Talks about how Melanie Tippi Hedren's description of the bird's behavior is ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense, and she has to be wrong.
This young lady said there was an attack on the school.
Impossible.
And there's this drunkard in the diner who's talking about it's the end of the world. And we get the sense that he's more correct than the professional ornithologist is.
It's the end of the world!
There's also the scene close to this where the gas station blows up, and it's shot from the bird's eye view. Hitchcock's camera remains on the ground up until a very crucial point, and then he's with the birds, he's up there, he's showing you the point of view of the agent that's creating this destruction. And there's an implication there that this agent is implacable and will not be satisfied. So I think The Birds definitely fits into this continuum, and indeed is one of the greatest of these kind of films. But relative to Waterworld, I think where we start seeing things that are directly related is in 1970 with a film called No Blade of Grass, directed by the actor turned director Cornell Wilde, whose approach to directing was very, very strong. He was a kind of a matinee, idol, groomed sort of actor from the 40s onward who had ambitions to direct. And once he realized those ambitions, he made some very distinctive films, including The Naked Prey.
No blade of grass.
No Blade of Grass begins with a theme song sung by Roger Whittaker, who many of you may know as your grandparents' favorite popular singer. It's an ecological ballad.
A family runs for its life from a deadly virus that threatens to swallow up the earth.
Film is hard-hitting from the very beginning. There are multiple montages of smokestacks and car exhausts. There are images of dead fish, starving children in Africa, mushroom clouds. The Earth is under siege because of an event that has rendered it such that, according to the narration,
and then one day the polluted Earth could take no more.
And mankind itself is reduced to an incredibly atavistic state of kill or be killed.
No room to run. No place to hide. No blade of grass.
A sort of precursor to this is a film from the early 60s called Panic at Year Zero, an American film directed by Ray Milland, in which a dysfunctional family going off on vacation and they hear of a nuclear explosion and they encounter all this anarchy.
After all these years, I thought I knew you, but you turned out to be a stranger.
We are fighting for our lives, Anne.
In No Blade of Grass, what the Earth is suffering from is a grass disease. Livestock can't grow. In England, where it's set, the rich are still chowing down while China is starving and the Chinese government is ordering hundreds of thousands of people massacred.
Unanimously condemned as barbarous, the nerve gas bombings by the Chinese Air Force of major population areas.
The protagonists of this film realize they're going to have to get moving and find a place where they can start again, where this grass disease hasn't taken hold.
The situation here is approaching anarchy. There are riots in London already.
The film is just brutal. One of the members of the group just decides that he's going to have the teenage daughter of the guy who's leading the group.
You want me to be more explicit? I'm a widower now. She's a single girl.
The movie makes its way to a really unpleasant conclusion, and Cornell Wilde himself, I believe, comes on in voiceover at the end and says,
"This motion picture is not a documentary, but it could be."
Another film that came out around this time is The Omega Man, 1971 film, starring Charlton Heston, who seems to be one of the sole survivors of a global pandemic that has rendered the remainder of the Earth's population kind of mindless zombies. It's based on the novel I Am Legend, which was made into a film called Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price. But The Omega Man brings it all into a then contemporary cultural context.
The last man on Earth lives in a fortress.
You know, you've got Charlton Heston's character taking over the only movie theater in town and watching Woodstock and looking at the hippies being all hopeful and saying, "Right on, man." Where in the meantime, he's got to scrape up a way to live in this desolate urban wasteland.
The last man on Earth always carries an automatic weapon.
More to the point in terms of ecological disaster movies, there's Soylent Green, directed by Richard Fleischer, also starring Charlton Heston. Like No Blade of Grass, this one opens with a ecological depredation montage of smokestacks and car exhausts, and it's set in a future where the Earth is completely overpopulated. Again, it's also a future where what we now call the 1% are living not as high as they do today, but relatively higher because everybody else eats this concoction called Soylent Green.
Step right up. Soylent Green. Soylent Green right here.
Joseph Cotten plays one of these rich guys. When he's murdered, Charlton Heston, who plays this pretty fast and loose police detective.
Detective Sergeant Thorne. He has a 2-year backlog of unsolved murders. Now he's on a case that must be solved.
He goes and investigates the case in his own way. This a movie that putatively takes place in 2022. It's based on a novel by the sci-fi master Harry Harrison called Make Room, which had a somewhat more, I wouldn't say comic, but more directly satiric emphasis than the movie does. The early 70s had a fair number of these pictures. There was an unusual picture called The Hellstrom Chronicle from 1971, innovative documentary fiction hybrid about the struggle for survival between man and insect.
The insect, in a frightening tour de force of adaptability, proved conclusively that he could endure where man would ultimately fail.
There was one film called ZPG, which stands for Zero Population Growth, from 1972. That's a fiction film that's actually based on a nonfiction book by Paul Ehrlich And it's a possible precursor to the film Children of Men. Couples are no longer permitted to reproduce.
Childbearing is herewith forbidden.
And Oliver Reed and Geraldine Chaplin play a couple who dare to have a child in this society.
Punishable by death.
Also from 1972 is Silent Running, the film directed by the special effects artist Douglas Trumbull, in which Bruce Dern is the last guy looking after the final ecosystem of the Earth.
Space convoy on a strange voyage, carrying a rare cargo. The forests, the plants, the growing things doomed to extinction on Earth.
Because Earth is no longer able to support ecosystems, there's now this giant spaceship that contains forests and plants and gardens, and he's the one guy looking after it. Now, if you know the temperament of the characters Bruce Dern tended to play in the 1970s, you understand that in this film he's going to be a little stressed out.
You can't blow up this forest.
Phase 4 is the only directorial effort by the graphic artist and title craftsman Saul Bass.
Please, go away.
It's a very unusual movie about ants developing a hive mind and taking over the planet, including humanity.
How do you fight a force that knows what your next move will be before you think of it?
And then there were disaster movies, one of which is called When Time Ran Out. It's a purely sensationalistic film. It shows volcanoes going off and all of the concurrent damage associated with that. It's not a movie that's about how humans have screwed up their world. In the years since Waterworld, we've had films such as Deep Impact and Armageddon. Then again, these are not our fault movies. It's something from outer space that's hurtling towards us. For as many apocalypse movies as have been produced, very few, or relatively few, are kind of willing to admit the ways that human beings are actually destroying their own planet. And finally, there's the 2008 film with the title 2012. In which neutrinos from a solar flare bring about not just warming, but freezing. This is another film from Roland Emmerich, whose Independence Day posited an apocalypse brought about by aliens just blowing stuff up. Even in a movie like Day of the Animals, there's a mention of the ozone layer.
The Earth's ozone layer was being depleted by a constant release of various chemical wastes in the atmosphere.
And that's the precipitating event. In the Emmerich films, they talk about precipitating events, but they don't really carry much, if you'll excuse the term, water. Now, Waterworld is an interesting case because it came along at a new point in Hollywood history where genres had a different kind of critical profile and different kind of economical profile. Almost all the movies that I've discussed prior to this were movies that were made by smaller companies, movies that had smaller budgets, movies that, for whatever reason, were relegated to a kind of B-picture status, at least as far as the studios that made them were concerned. They weren't considered prestige projects. Now, once you get into the 1980s and 1990s, you get science fiction movies that are prestige projects because of the success of prior movies that were made for low budgets.
The temperatures climbed. The vast fields of ice at its poles melted, and the oceans rose.
The science of Waterworld, in which the melting ice caps create rising sea levels, is pretty viable.
Centuries later, few people remain.
But the movie's emphasis, and this is true also of a movie that Kevin Costner produced and starred in right after Waterworld, which is The Postman. The movie is very allegorical. These journeys of an archetypal hero-redeemer.
Among them, a man who still searches.
It's noteworthy that Kevin Costner's character in both Waterworld and The Postman, he doesn't have a name. He doesn't have a proper name. In Waterworld, he's known as the Mariner, and in The Postman, he's known as, take a wild guess, the Postman.
And the human dream is the search for a mythical place.
And the paradise, the Eden of Waterworld's world is the top of Mount Everest, because that's one of the only things that's still dry land. But the Mariner, in fulfilling his allegorical function, he cannot stay on dry land. He must be a creature of the water. Now, Waterworld was pretty critically lambasted when it first came out. And I think part of that had to do with Costner himself.
Happy now?
Not that he's a bad actor, but in films such as these, think back to Omega Man, think back to Soylent Green. You have these lead characters in films like those played by a guy like Charlton Heston, who's a very kind of stentorian actor. He hews to a certain kind of oratorical gravitas, whereas Costner is almost more like a Gary Cooper. He's laconic, big speeches don't necessarily come easily to him. That's part of his charm in Bull Durham, is when he's making a big speech, he's making it in a way that's not like a person who makes speeches makes them.
What do you believe in then?
The small of a woman's back, the hanging curveball, high fiber, good scotch. And I believe in long, slow, deep, soft, wet kisses.
And there's something I think that we've been conditioned by these movies to expect these stentorian characters to carry the allegorical function of these heroes on their journey. And that Costner's persona doesn't really fit in with that.
You talk a lot.
I talk a lot because you don't talk at all.
Basically, Waterworld is an excellent example of the sci-fi apocalypse film as a prestige picture.
Oh, thank God.
But Waterworld, I think, is a movie that deserves the reconsideration that it's getting through this package. And I think because of the way it bridges a gap between the sort of sensationalistic, lurid, low-budgeted, end-of-the-world picture and the all bells and whistles, very sleekly made Hollywood blockbuster. And also the fact that, you know, it's got a point about what we're doing to our planet, makes it almost exemplary eco-disaster movie.